Ladies and gents, welcome back. Last time we left off with a blank white screen that showed we've set up our environment correctly. Today we're going to start building our app. The first thing we're going to do is create this side menu. Before we start creating this side menu, let's create a custom widget that we're going to use pretty much everywhere in this app. This is going to be a box layout that allows us to easily change its render properties. These are properties like its background color, its border radius used to round its corners like this, as well as give it a bottom border. To build this widget, go to the Components folder and create a new file. Let's call this file box.py. In this file, let's import a few things we are going to need. First, we're going to import the box layout because this widget is essentially still a Kivy box layout. The next thing we want to do is import a few Kivy properties that we're going to use throughout our app. Then we're going to import our builder so we can style this box layout in Kivy. And then finally, we're going to import Kivy's metric system so that we can size our box layout and everything in it based on the screen size. Now that we have all our imports, the next thing we want to do is create our custom widget class. This is going to be called background box. Next, let's initialize this and pass on any arguments to the original Kivy box layout. Now that we have this class, the next thing we want to do is add a few properties that we're going to be changing dynamically depending on how the widget is used. The first one will be the background color. We want to be able to change this dynamically with just one command. Next, we also want to be able to change the border radius of the box. We also want to be able to change the border color. And then we also want the box to know whether we want the border that we're using at the bottom or to be right round the widget. So if you check here, we have a border that is going right round this box. But in this one, we only have the border at the bottom. So this is going to be the flag that deals with that. Finally, we want to be able to change the border's width. By default, this is going to be 1 pixel. Now that we have all our properties, let us go ahead and style this background box widget based on those properties. We're going to then style this in Kivy. So let's open up our Kivy string here and then close it off. If you're not familiar with the Kivy language, I'll try to explain everything as I go. First, you need to tell Kivy which widget the styles are for. In this case, they're for the background box widget. Now let's access the canvas of this widget and start manipulating it. In the canvas, the first thing we want to add is the color. This will be the color used as the background in this case. Next, let's define which color this is going to be. In our case, the color of this background is going to be whatever the user enters as the color in our background color property we defined earlier. Now that we have the color, what do we want to do with the color? Well, we want to use that color as the color of our rounded rectangle. We are essentially drawing a rectangle on our widget's canvas, thus giving it the illusion of a background. Now, where do we want to put this rectangle? Well, we want to put it exactly where this custom widget is located. Next, how big should that rounded rectangle be? Well, it's going to be as big as the custom widget itself. Finally, let's deal with the border radius of our widget. This is what gives us those rounded corners you see here. So the roundness of this is going to be whatever the border radius property was set to. The next thing we want to do is deal with the borders. So first, we need the color for the border. Let's add that instruction. Now, what is the color going to be? Well, let's add it like this. This means, in this case, the color, by default, is going to be a transparent black if we specified we only want a bottom border, but if not, then the color will be whatever the user set as the border color. Next, we need to draw that border with that color. To draw it, we're going to use the line instruction. Now, how do we want to draw it exactly? Well, we are going to draw it using the same instruction for the rounded rectangle. This means the border will start from the bottom left, then go up, then go to the top right of the widget, then go down, and finally close off where it started using, of course, the defined border radius. Finally, let's also set how thick this line should be. This will be controlled by the width property we set in our widget properties. Next, let's deal with the case where we only want the bottom border. So again, we start with the color for this border. So which color is that going to be? Well, in this case, the color should be whatever the border color was set to, but only if we specified that we want a bottom border. Otherwise, the color should be a transparent black. This is essentially the opposite of the instruction we set for our line instruction. All right, now let's draw that bottom border. We could use a line, but in this case, I like to use a rectangle instead. Let's add that. And then the position of this rectangle is going to be the position of this custom widget. This is important. The size is going to be on the x-axis, it's going to be whatever the width of the custom widget is. Then on the y-axis, which is the height, it's just going to be whatever the border width was set to by the user. So if it's 2, then it's just going to be 2 pixels thick. This gives us that line that we want. And with that done, we now our first custom widget. Let's give this widget a whirl. To use this background box, first we need to import it. We are going to be importing all our custom widgets in this main window file. Let's import our box like this. Next, let's add in our box down here. Finally, we want to add in some properties for the background box. The first property we have is going to be the size hint on the x-axis. We're then going to give our box a static width of 280. Next, let's change the background color of the box to white. Let's also give it a border color. Now let's go ahead and give it an orientation so that all of our widgets are placed from top to bottom. Let's also add in a bit of spacing for the widgets we will add in the box. Finally, let's add in some padding for the widgets we will add. That completes the properties for this box. Let's add another box to take the rest of the width. Before we run our app, let's go to Components folder and create a new file. Call it init.py. In this file, let's import our background box component like this. Let's now run this app and see what we have. If you get this white background box here, then our box is working correctly. Now that our box works correctly, let's start adding in the widgets for the sidebar. First, we want to add in this image, which is the logo. To do that, let's go inside the background box. Let's create a simple box layout and give it some properties. So first, we're going to give it vertical orientation so that it aligns everything vertically. Next, let's give it a static height. First, we have to set the size hint on the y-axis equal to none. Otherwise, Kivy will ignore the height that we set. Now let's set the height to 128 pixels. Now we want our logo to always be centered. So to do that, we're going to add in an anchor layout. Next, let's make sure that on the y-axis, it's always centered, and on the x-axis, the image will be left aligned. Now let's add in an async image. You could just use a simple image here, but I use async in case you want to use a URL as the source instead of a local path. Let's add in the source of the image. Now let's give that image a static height as well. We're going to set our size hint y to none first, and then the height of this is going to be just 54 pixels. Let's add in another background box that we are going to use as the divider for this logo. Let's add in that box. Let's give it a size hint of absolutely nothing and a static height of 1 pixel. Next, let's give it a background color, which then makes it look like a line. It's still a background box, but at this point, since the height is just 1, it's going to look like a line. The next thing we want to do is add in another box here to take up the available height, just to visualize what we currently have. Let's run the app again to see what we currently have. Looking pretty good so far. Next up is the avatar section. Let's add box layout, give it vertical orientation, and then a size hint of none on the y-axis so we can give it a static height. The static height for this one is going to be 82 pixels. All right, next, let's add another box to contain the image and the name and user role. Now, in this box, let's add an anchor layout for the avatar to center it. Let's set the size hint X this time on the anchor layout. This is because this time we want to set a static width, not the height. Now let's set the width of this anchor layout to be whatever the height of this layout is. This ensures the anchor layout is always going to be a perfect square. Now let's create the avatar. You'll notice our avatar is a circle. This is not native in Kivy, so we will hack our own custom widget in here. To do this, let's add in a widget. We set the size hint for both the X and Y axis as none because we are going to set the width and height ourselves. The height of this avatar is going to be 54 pixels, And to make sure that it's always a square again, the width is going to be whatever the height is. Now let's add in the image itself to this widget. We will do this by painting it on the canvas. Inside the canvas, we will need the color instruction for the image to be visible. Now we need to actually set the color value. To make sure the image is displayed correctly, we will set this color to white. Since we want the image to appear as a circle, we will use an ellipse instruction. So, where do we want to put this ellipse? Well, we want to put this ellipse wherever this widget is located in our app. Next, how big should this ellipse be? This ellipse is going to be as big as the widget itself. Now here's where the magic happens. Instead of drawing the ellipse with the white color, we want to take the pixels of our avatar image and use those to draw the ellipse. To draw this ellipse, we need to tell Kivy the angle to start drawing from. We will start at 0, then we need to also tell Kivy where to stop. We will stop at 360. We all know that 0 to 360 is a full circle, so that's what we get. We should now have our avatar. Next, let's add the box layout that will contain the rest of our labels. Now go ahead, save this, and run it to see our avatar. Perfect. We now have our round avatar. The next thing we want is to add in the name and role of this user. First, let's make sure this box layout aligns its children vertically. And now let's add in a label for the name. Let's also add the text of this label to be the name of the user. Now let's make sure that this text uses the fonts that we defined in our theme file. The size of the text in this label is going to be the size of the label itself. Next, let's align this text vertically. We want to align it to the bottom to get it closer to the role text. Finally, let's change the color of the text in the label. We will set this to be the text color we set in our theme file. That's for the name. For the role, we want to add in another label. This will more or less have the same properties, so we need the text for this label, which in this case is going to be the admin. Next, set the text of the label to be the size of the label itself. Next, set the font of this label to be the font we defined in the theme file. Now let's make sure that this is aligned to the top so that it's close to the name label. The color of this text is going to be the color defined in the theme as well. Next, let's add in the right arrow icon. Let's go down here and create the icon label. Let's add in the text of this label. The text is going to be the name of the icon. To render our icon, we use this icon function, so let's make sure it's imported from our lib folder up here. Now we can use our icons that we registered in our main.py file. Alright, now pay attention because this is extremely important. To render our icons, we need to set the markup property of this label to true. If you don't do this, Kivy will not transform your icon name into an actual icon. It will just set it as text. Alright, next let's give our icon a color. We're going to give it the secondary color for our text. And then let's give this a static width. To give this a width, remember, we have to set the size hint x property to none first, and then give our label its width. That's it. Now let's add in the divider yet again. So to do that, let's go down here and use the same trick we used before with the background box. Give it a size hint of absolutely nothing, because we want to give this a height of 1. Next, let's give this box a background color. Let's give it a background of the divider color. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and run this and see what we currently have. Looking good. Now let's add a grid to hold our navigation buttons. So let's go down here and create a grid layout. Let's give this grid an ID because we may need to reference this later. Next, let's give it some padding so that our navigation buttons don't stick to the left. Let's also give it some spacing to space out our navigation buttons. Let's set the column property of our grid to be 1. This essentially creates a box that places its children vertically from top to bottom. We are done with our grid. Next, let's create a custom widget that will act as our navigation button. So go down here and create a new widget like so. We will call this one nav pill, and it's going to be a button. Next, let's set its size hint on the y-axis to be none, so we can set its height. Let's go ahead and give it a height of 36 pixels. Now let's give our pill a custom property called active, which defaults to false. We will be styling our button dynamically based on whether it is currently the active button or not. Let's add the rest of the properties. So we need the icon property as a string, which will hold the button icon, and also the text property, which will hold the text of this button. Next, let's use our background box again to control the background and roundness of our pill. Let's change the background color of this box so that if it's active, the pill will have a color of our primary color in the theme file. If it's not active, then it's just going to be transparent. Next, let's set the border radius to 8 pixels. Next, let's go ahead and add in the text for the icon. The text on this label is going to be whatever the icon was set to. And remember, to render icons, you need to set markup to true because it's not just text. We need a static width as well. So we set size hint x to nothing and set the width of this icon to whatever the height of this label is. Now let's give our icon a color. So the color for this icon is going to be the secondary color if this button is currently the active navigation item. Otherwise, it's just going to be the secondary text color that we set in our theme file. Let's also set the text size to be whatever the label's size is. Next, we need to align this icon so that it's always in the center. We do this with H-align, and we put it to the center. This is horizontal alignment. We also want it to be vertically aligned to the center as well. So V-align, middle. The next thing we want now is the label. So we're going to put this label inside a box layout because we want to pad it just a bit. So let's add in that box layout, and then let's pad it on the top so that it aligns with the icon. Now, let's add in that label itself in here. And then the text for that label is going to be whatever was set in this widget's text property. We want to use the fonts that were defined in our theme. So for this label, we use the heading font, which is going to be a bolder text if the pill is active. Otherwise, we use the subheading font. The next thing we want is the color for that label. This is going to be dynamic. So we're going to use the primary color if we are active. Otherwise, we're going to use the grayish secondary color. Next, we want the text size to be the size of this label. And then let's align this horizontally to the left, but vertically. We want to make sure it's always center aligned. Now let's just add in that arrow line at the end. This will be a label, and the text for that label is going to be an icon, and the icon is going to be a chevron. Now, since we're using an icon, we need to set markup equal to true. We want this to be a static width again, since it's just an icon, so set size hint x as none, and then the width is going to be whatever the height is. Finally, we want to set the color. We want the icon to be grayish, which is the text secondary theme color. That's it for our custom pill. So let's go ahead and try this out in our grid layout. Let's add in the dashboard nav item by simply adding nav pill. Now let's set the properties needed by the pill. We said it needs text. We will set this as dashboard. Next, we set the icon to use. So in this case, the icon is icon grid. These icons are feather icons. If you go to feathericons.com, the names of the icons will be displayed there, so you can use any of those names if you want. Let's set this pill as active since it's the first screen. For now, this is it. So if we go ahead and just copy this a few times and save, we can run this and see how it looks. All right, looking lovely. Let's now add in the rest of the navigation items. So change this to shipments, change this to clients, change this to invoices, and then finally, we want to change this to analytics. Now, let's change the icons. So for shipment, the icon is icon package. For clients, the icon is icon users. For invoices, we are going to be using the file text icon. And then for analytics, we're going to be using the activity icon. Lastly, let's add in the settings nav item at the bottom. Since it's also a nav pill, I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this and then simply push it out of this containing grid. Next, change the text to settings, and the icon to use is the settings icon. Now let's run this and see what we currently have. Our navigation looks good, but now everything is currently active. We don't want that. Let's remove the active tag on all of the nav pills except the dashboard. Now let's run this again, and as you can see, we are now done with this side navigation. All right, so we're going to stop here this time. In the next video, we will add the top action bar. Thanks for watching. All the code for this video will be in the Patreon link in the description. Speaking of Patreon, you can help out this channel by becoming a Patreon. If you enjoyed this content, please give it a quick like to help the YouTube gods notice it. Also, subscribe to this channel to get more content like this. See you next time.